Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tired F1 pod, coming to you straight after qualifying for the Spanish Grand Prix 2024. And what a qualifying that was. Lando Norris takes pole after setting what he called the best lap of his entire career. We're going to have a little look at it with some telemetry. So here we go. This is the entire lap. And as usual, we have our traces. So our top trace is the speed trace. Underneath that is the delta. And the delta, again, I say it every week, but I'll say it again now. Lando was the faster of the two drivers. So his orange line is the reference. Max is the blue line. And any time that Max is below that orange line, he's quicker than Lando. And any time that Max is above that orange line, he is slower than Lando. And we've got our usual throttle and brake traces just underneath that. We're going to have a little look at those when we take a closer look at some of the sectors. But just looking at the overall lap, again, I want to bring your guys' attention to the delta, certainly in the first sector. So the first sector takes us right up until turn 5. And here what you can see is going into the first corner, Max has higher end of straight speed going into turn 1, and that correlates to his delta being slightly better than Lando's up to that first corner. And we think that that's probably because, as we saw in comms and in the analysis by the Sky team immediately afterwards, Sergio Perez essentially sacrificed his Q3 lap to give Max a tow. And although Lando got a bit of a tow from, I think it was Esteban Ocon, down the pit straight, Max definitely got a better one. And it seemed to pay dividends through the course of that first corner and most of Sector 1. But Lando fought back pretty hard. So this is us zoomed into sectors 2 and 3. And the marker, the big white line, is dropped at the beginning of Q3, because I think there's a bit of a demarcation between how these laps fared for both of these two drivers. Lando was much the quicker of the two drivers in Sector 2, and Max was much quicker in Sector 3. And I have a sneaky suspicion that that is because Lando, doing all the damage that he did in Sector 2, took a little bit out of his tyres and allowed Max to start to come back at him again in the final sector. So let's just have a look at how that happened. So first of all, let's have a look at the speed trace through Sector 2. And you can see that in every corner from turn 6 onwards, you can see that Lando has a higher minimum speed through each one of those corners. And if you look at the delta, you can see that at the end of every corner, there's a step change in how far Max is away from Lando's reference line. So Lando was taking chunks out of Max in each corner of Sector 2, and you can see that in the throttle trace as well. I think it's really clear here that where Max has to just hesitate a little bit on the throttle out of each corner, Lando is able to just stamp on the throttle and just launch himself out of each corner and get himself further and further away from Max's time. But I think that liberty that he's taken with the throttle pedal starts to cause him a bit of a problem in Sector 3. So if we start to follow this lap from the marker for Sector 2 onwards, so that's essentially from turn 10, that's sort of the corner at the end of the short straight on from Campsa, which is the big full throttle right-hander, puts a big compression through the car. You can see here that both of these guys take a decent line through turn 10. It's a corner where if your car isn't set up right, or if you've taken a bit too much out of it, you'll get a whole heap of understeer out of it. And you could see that repeatedly for multiple drivers across multiple laps, that they were getting a lot of understeer. But the onboards for Lando through turn 10 suggested that actually he took a really nice line. He clipped the apex, not too much understeer, was able to take a decent line through turn 11, the right-hander. But Max, as you can see here, was able to take an even better line, and at the end of the straight, going into the final corner, was even faster than Lando was. And again, if we look at the final corner, so if we the approach out of turn 11, turn 12, and then into 13, it's all full throttle at this point. They're just going for it. But out of that final corner, Lando has to take a little bit of a confidence lift on the throttle. And I think if you put those two things together, the slightly lower speed coming out of turn 11 and the lift that he has to have out of the final corner, I think he'd probably just taken a tiny little bit out of his tyres, doing everything that he was doing to get away from Max in sector 2. And the delta seems to bear that out as well, where Max's delta starts to come back down towards Lando's reference line. So Lando did more than enough in sector 2 to offset the fact that he probably cooked his tyres a little bit going into the final sector. But those are the margins. That's what it takes. And I think even with the fact that his tyres were probably past their best in sector 3, that was probably the way that he was going to get that lap together to beat Max Verstappen. I would probably agree with him that was Lando thinking his way through the lap, and you could call it maybe his best lap in F1 to date. Now, it wouldn't be a tired F1 pod if I didn't talk about Lewis Hamilton and George Russell and Lewis's qualifying. And Lewis managed to out-qualify George, so I don't have to put my head on a block with a guillotine just yet. And this lap, I think, actually, first of all, we are going to talk about the emails and the sabotage and all of the things that have been discussed over this weekend a bit later in the week. But I think this lap seemed to suggest that the Mercedes is coming back to Lewis. It's allowing Lewis to do what he does in the car and drive it the way that he wants to get the best lap time out of it. And I think sector 3 really shows you what that means. So let's just have a little look at sector 3. Sector 1 and 2 were pretty close, but George was actually quicker than Lewis going into sector 3. And I think this again goes back to Lewis maybe preserving a bit in his tyres to give him what he needed to get the most out of the lap in the final sector, because that's where he did the damage. Here we are in the final sector, and the first corner is turn 10, and you can see here that Lewis is able to brake later and into turn 11, which if you take a decent line through turn 10, don't get too much understeer, you can get a really nice line through turn 11. What he's able to do here is brake later for both of those corners, but pick up the throttle earlier and harder and stay on it more than George is able to through both those corners. That is exactly what Lewis likes to do. He likes to brake super late, get the car to rotate, and then get on the throttle early. But he needs a stable rear end to be able to do that, and a strong front end to be able to get the car in the first place. And for the first time this season, the car seems to be letting him do that. That's why he's able to brake late and keep the throttle up. And he's when I said last video that I think if the car starts to come back towards both drivers, if the car starts to do what they want it to do, Lewis will exponentially get better. This is what I mean. Braking later, picking up the throttle earlier, and therefore able to carry better minimum speed through both those corners, and able to essentially overcome the slight deficit that he had to George over the first two sectors of that lap. And I think if this continues, I think in the next two races of this triple header, if through setup and better understanding of the car, they're able to get the car even better, Lewis will continue this little spell of qualifying success. But we're only a third of the way through, and we'll see how things go. And on that bombshell, it's time to call it a day. But if you like what we're doing, as usual, please like, please subscribe, please leave us a comment. We read all of them and we respond to as many as we possibly can. This has been another qualifying telemetry vid, but we will see you after the race tomorrow.